Okay, well, thank you very much, Nina, for coming today and joining Cheese Hangouts.
Well, it's great to be here, Babs. Thanks for having me.
All right. So in case you're tired of answering the same old questions, I'm going to start with just a few light ones just to allow your audience to get to know you a little bit better. Things that most people are not going to ask you. So the first one is, what is your favorite flower? Flower like blooming flower.
Blooming flower. That's definitely a question I haven't been asked before. I would say blue hydrangeas.
I play the guitar. Do you play a musical instrument?
I play a number of instruments not very well. I play guitar not very well, and I play piano not very well. And I used to sing in choruses all growing up, so I can sing.
Okay, so now let's get to the really important topics. And first of all, I want the audience to know right away that when she and I talk about cheese, we are talking about really high-quality cheese made from the milk of healthy, grass-fed, pasture-raised animals, not from the kind of the overcrowded, confined, ill-treated animals, just to let everybody know about that, because not all cheese is the same, right? Okay, Nina, so one of the main themes in your book, which is, look at all the tabs on this thing, looks like a coloring book, I love it. One of the themes in your book is that the fear of fat, especially saturated fat, is not based on scientific evidence. In fact, chapter 10 is titled, Why Saturated Fat is Good for You. So on page 325, I'm detail-oriented. Yes. You say that eating saturated fat is healthier than eating carbohydrates. In other words, cheese is probably healthier than bread. Yay!
Actually, that sounds like such a controversial statement, and yet it is the consensus statement. The consensus statement by our nutrition experts now is that saturated fats are healthier than carbohydrates. The expert community has really come to understand that carbohydrates, large amounts of carbohydrates, like too many crackers with your cheese,
right? Exactly. Right.
Provoke sugar in the bloodstream. Your body understands carbohydrates, whether it's bread or if it's a candy bar. Those are basically processed in your body as sugar, and so too many of those sugars in your bloodstream is what provokes a kind of state of metabolic unhealth that leads to obesity and type 2 diabetes. So there have been all these studies looking at comparing saturated fats to carbohydrates. And as early as 2010, there were groups of scientists, consensus scientists, including some who had traditionally been very hostile to saturated fats, coming to the conclusion that actually carbohydrates are worse than saturated fats. So that's the takeaway. Better to have cheese without the cracker as a snack than it is to have, actually better to have that cheese than it is to have fruit as a snack, because fruit has a lot of sugar in it. So that's a very practical takeaway from that knowledge.
Cheese lovers will love that, and I'm definitely loving it too. Okay, so you're saying that cheese lovers across the world do not have to worry about getting heart disease as a result of eating high-fat cheese. Is that what you're saying?
Right, and just to explain a little further, it's saturated fats, as many people now know, were condemned really going back to the 1950s, when the idea was that saturated fats and dietary cholesterol, which are both in cheese, that those caused heart disease. That was sort of the answer given. It was called the diet heart hypothesis, and at the time when heart disease was nobody really knew what caused heart disease, it was that hypothesis that kind of stepped into the void. And was accepted first by the American Heart Association, which issued the first recommendations anywhere in the world in 1961, telling everybody to avoid saturated fat and cholesterol in order to protect themselves against a heart attack. And then that spread all over the world to all the recommendations that we have today. So what happened was that recommendation in 1961 was never based on good science. It was based on this very weak kind of science called epidemiology. And then when the government, our government, Australian government, UK government, around the world, they all spent billions of dollars trying to prove in a more rigorous kind of science called clinical trials. They did all these trials where you actually divide people into two groups. You feed half the group a lot of milk and butter and cheese and meat, and you feed the other half, soy-filled milk, soy-filled cheese,
yeah,
non-meat
not
meat,
real.
not real.
Yeah.
To see if saturated fat and cholesterol could be proven by this more rigorous science to cause heart disease, right? And those studies, none of those could show that saturated fats had any effect on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality. So that really should have been like the nail in the coffin of the diet heart hypothesis. And we should no longer have any caps on saturated fat, and we should no longer be fearing cheese. We should not be eating low-fat dairy of any kind. But, the story that I tell in my book is like, well, what happened to that science? Why did that not? Why did we not drop our caps on saturated fat? What happened? And that's really a story of politics more than anything else, which is that science was pretty much just ignored or buried in basements and not incorporated into.
Or published 16 years too late.
Yeah, or published in out-of-the-way journals that nobody paid attention to. All those studies were paid for by taxpayer dollars, right? So that's the government investing in nutrition studies in order to inform nutrition policy. But then when it didn't come out the way that they expected it, those studies didn't turn out the way they wanted, they basically just ignored them. So, but the reality is that's what the science says. I mean, the good news is, the bad news is our government needs to catch up with the science that it funded. The good news is the science is very clear about what it says. And it says that after testing tens of thousands of people in these clinical trials, saturated fats have no effect on your cardiovascular mortality. So just one little hitch in here, people will say, yeah, but it raises your LDL cholesterol. That's your bad cholesterol going up. And that is true that sometimes happens. But the whole cholesterol story is just much more complicated than just LDL, right? It's also true that saturated fats raise your good cholesterol. That's your HDL going up. So, one bad thing happens, but one good thing happens when you eat saturated fats. And it looks like those effects really just cancel each other out, because in the end, what you really care about is, will I get a heart attack? Will I die? And the answer from all these experiments is no. So whatever is going on with your cholesterol, which we don't really understand all that well, that is really not as relevant as the larger questions which are, will I die from heart disease? And the studies clearly say no. You will not. Eating saturated fat at the levels that they tested, which were really nearly twice what we're recommended to eat today, did not have any effect on cardiovascular outcomes.
Awesome.